So when we ended the book of Genesis, Joseph and his family were reunited and they were living in Egypt. The book of Exodus starts out with these words. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Those words set the stage for what happens in the book of Exodus. The people of Israel are growing, and the Pharaoh doesn't like it. And so the Pharaoh starts off with delivering an edict to the people that all the Hebrew baby boys should be killed. And so that's what we see at the beginning of the book of Exodus, particularly at the end of chapter 1. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, "When you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a boy, kill him, but if it is a girl, she shall live." But of course the midwives don't do what the Pharaoh says, and behind his back they let the Hebrew boys live, and they basically hide them. And that's what happens to Moses. So the book of Exodus introduces us to the character of Moses, who will be seen all the way out throughout the rest of the Torah, all the way to the end of Deuteronomy. So what we know about Moses, we see primarily in these books. But his early life is a little bit like the life of Jesus, which, we'll talk about when I get to the Gospels. So Moses is saved from death by his mother. She hides him in a basket. She sends him down the Nile River, and he's found by Pharaoh's daughter. Pharaoh's daughter raises him as her own in Pharaoh's palace. He grows up and begins to understand that he is not an Egyptian, but rather a Hebrew. And so he murders an Egyptian overseer, and then he flees the country. Eventually, in Exodus chapter 3, Moses is introduced to God. And that is the story of the burning bush, which might be familiar to you. So Moses hears the voice of God calling him, saying, "Moses, Moses." And he said, "Here I am." And then God said, "Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground." And this is where God introduces himself as the I Am, the great I Am. And he calls Moses to lead the people out of Egypt. Now, Moses was called to lead the people out of Egypt to worship for a few days, not lead them way out all over the place. Just lead them away. And so Moses is not quite sure about this, and he tells God, I'm a stutterer. I have problems speaking. And God takes care of that. God shows him God's power, and so eventually Moses makes his way back to Egypt. Now, Moses also finds Aaron, his brother, and Aaron becomes kind of a spokesperson for Moses. Aaron speaks when Moses can't, and Aaron actually brings on a couple of the plagues too. Pharaoh is the king of Egypt. Now, Pharaoh is not a name; it's a title, and he is the king of Egypt. There's lots of speculation about who this particular Pharaoh is, but the consensus seems to be that it is Pharaoh Ramses. And so the Pharaoh doesn't know God. We see that in chapter 5 of Exodus. It says in verse 2, "But Pharaoh said, 'Who is the Lord, that I should heed him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go.'" The Pharaoh here is introduced as someone who is stubborn, someone who doesn't want to listen to this God that he doesn't know. Then, of course, we have the Hebrews, and the Hebrews here they're not called Jews, they're not called Israelites yet, they're just Hebrews. They're the descendants of Abraham and Joseph, and they are the slaves to Pharaoh. They also believe in Yahweh, but they also believe that there are other gods around too. And so we're starting to look a little bit at monotheism, but not so much. Right now, these folks believe in Yahweh, and they eventually want to go and worship him, so they follow Moses. And then, of course, we have Yahweh. That is the personal name of God. It is a derivative of a Hebrew word that means I am, or I will be, or I was. And so it encompasses all the forms of to be, to exist, to live. And this God in the book of Exodus is the creator, the destroyer. He's the enemy of Pharaoh. He is revealed to Moses, and eventually he is revealed to the Israelites. So I've already said a lot of what happens, what you see on this slide. When Moses fled Egypt, he eventually married and had children, and so we know that by the time he returned to Egypt, he was already married. We also see what happens in Exodus 3 through 6. This is a little bit more of a specific view of that encounter. God speaks to Moses. We call this a theophany. Theophany is a technical, theological word that means an encounter with God. And that's what Moses has here at the burning bush. God reveals God's personal name to Moses. That is Yahweh. And God instructs Moses to perform wonders and signs. They're not really called plagues in the Bible. They're called wonders and signs. And these are the things that work like signs. They point the way to God. They show God's power and majesty and greatness and loyalty towards the people of Israel. But Moses isn't quite sure about this. And so he asks God for proof. And so God withers up his hand and then straightens it back out, and God turns his staff into a snake and then back again. And so Moses is pretty convinced, but he also is worried about his speech impediment, which may have been a stutter, but more likely it was more of a kind of a thick tongue, like a kind of a lisp, or maybe some other kind of inability to speak. But in the end, Moses leaves Midian, he goes back to Egypt, and he talks to the Pharaoh. Sorry, I hit the wrong button there. So in Exodus chapter 7 through 12, we have these 10 plagues. And this is where we get into the really literary genius of the book of Exodus. Particularly in these plagues, the pattern of the plagues. And they're all roughly the same. Moses approaches the Pharaoh and says, "Let my people go. I want to take them into the wilderness to worship for a few days." And the Pharaoh says, "No." And so then God brings on a sign. And the sign is one of these plagues. And after the plague, then Pharaoh pleads with Moses, "Please stop the plague, because they're so awful." So God relents, the plague goes away, and then we're told that Pharaoh is stubborn. Pharaoh has a hard heart. So one example is at the end of chapter 7, when the water gets turned back into water instead of blood. we see this. So Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, and he would not listen to them as the Lord had said. Pharaoh turned and went into his house, and he did not even take this to heart. And all the Egyptians had to dig along the Nile for water to drink, for they could not drink the water of the river. Pharaoh's hardened heart, that word, that phrase means stubbornness. Pharaoh's stubborn. And Pharaoh also believes that he is a god in his own right. And so part of what we can see in this story of the 10 plagues is a story that pits Pharaoh, an Egyptian god, against the God of the Israelites. And eventually what we see is that Yahweh wins the battle. Eventually, about halfway through the plagues, Pharaoh's magicians are no longer able to replicate whatever God is doing, and now it's just up to Pharaoh, and he can't do it. And so eventually, when we get to the death of the firstborn son, Pharaoh's son dies, and the Egyptians are all killed as they try to chase the Israelites out of Egypt. And so eventually, eventually the story is God wins. God wins over the Pharaoh. But unfortunately, the Israelites have to live through all these plagues first. And they see what the plagues have done to the Egyptians. And so as they get ready to leave Egypt, their trust is in God, who they've seen can defeat this awful Pharaoh. So at the end of the 10 plagues, the Israelites escape Egypt, and they have to put the blood of the lamb on their doorpost. God killed all the firstborn males that were not in a house with blood, and they leave very quickly. They gather up all their stuff, and they leave for a trip that they know they have to leave quickly or else they're going to get killed by the Egyptians. So they cross the Sea of Reeds, or the Red Sea as it's often called, and in chapter 15, they have a victory song led by Moses. And it says, I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he has thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my might, and he has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him. My father's God, and I will exalt him. And so the Israelites begin their journey into the wilderness by praising God and acknowledging everything that God has done for them and will do for them. Now, when they get into the wilderness, the first place that they go is Mount Sinai. And they receive the 10 Commandments.